Hello, family, and welcome to this episode of Legacy Chat. My name is Rick, and I'm an alcoholic. I was given the gift of sobriety on November 17th, 1987, and it's my privilege to be your host for this episode. Legacy Chat is a podcast made by and for members of AA to share their experience, strength, and hope on all three of our legacies in Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's a service of takethe12.org. That's takethe12.org, a three-legacy study website. All episodes of this podcast will be available to listen to or download completely free on takethe12.org. The primary purpose of our time together is to create a discussion space of our three legacies so our listeners might be able to have a richer and more personal experience of AA's 12 steps, 12 traditions, and 12 concepts for world service. Legacy Chat is not affiliated with Alcoholics Anonymous, and neither myself nor any of my guests in this podcast speak for AA as a whole. We're only here today to share our own unique experience on one of AA's three legacies. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about step 8 in our first legacy of recovery. And I'm so honored to have as my special guest with us today, Mary C. Mary, please introduce yourself and tell our listeners where you're from, your home group, your sobriety date, and a little bit about how you got to AA.
Okay. Hi, I'm Mary. I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date is January 3rd of 2010. My home group is Get in the Car in Grapevine. I'm generally from the Fort Worth area. And I got to AA accidentally through a treatment center. You know, I thought I was going for one thing. They slid a big book at me. So here I am.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much. All right, so let's so thanks so much and welcome, and I just go ahead and jump right into it. It says from the foreword of the 12 and 12, it says this: AA's 12 steps are a group of principles, spiritual in their nature, which if practiced as a way of life, can expel the obsession to drink and enable the sufferer to become happily and usefully whole. I always read that at the beginning of every episode because I think that I don't think I've ever seen a more beautiful explanation that Bill has given us about what our steps are. And it was very concise, very simple to understand. And the other reason that I love this is because in that foreword, where it says, it can expel the obsession to drink and enable the sufferer to become happily and usefully whole. That is both an internal recognition and an external recognition. Happily whole inside as a result of taking the 12 steps, but usefully whole externally. What am I going to learn? How am I going to become a different man today as a result of taking the 12 steps? And who am I going to be able to help by sharing that experience with them? So I always read that and I love it. All right, let's read the actual steps. So step 8, made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. The spiritual principle of this step, you know, we hear, it's not written down anywhere in our literature, but we hear that there are 36 spiritual principles, 12 in the steps, 12 spiritual principles in the traditions, and 12 spiritual principles in the concepts. And the one that I like to use for the spiritual principle I like to use for step 8 is love. As a result of my willingness to make that list of all of the hurt and harm that I've caused, the people that I've caused that harm to, the love that I am finding inside myself through a relationship with a God of my understanding is helping me to go out and begin to clean up all of that mess, right? And I've always believed that with each step, there's at least one thing that I need to walk away remembering. And with this step, I believe it's that, and we'll get into this as we kind of unpack step 8, but I believe an apology is not the same thing as an amends. And like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So let me throw out my first question to you. When I asked you to be a part of this episode or to be a part of this podcast, and I gave you which ones were available to share on. You chose step 8. Tell our listeners why you wanted to share on step 8.
Well, the reason I chose step 8 is because I had done a presentation at a women's weekend on step 8. And so I thought, I got this. I don't got this. So, I've been going over it and reading over it, and I'm just as lost as ever. So
Well, so then we're going to see what God's going to uncover for us today, right?
exactly.
So here's another question for you. Was there a specific moment in your recovery where the spiritual principle that's underlying this step came to life for you? And the spiritual principle that we're using for this is love. So was there tell me about a specific moment in your recovery where love came to life for you?
That's a good one. Um, you know, with my sponsorship, the sponsors I've had, they took it a little bit further, other than just love as a spiritual principle. They call it brotherly love. And
Right
so
on.
for me, that was, love for everybody. And I will have to share this very recent experience. When I did my first, fourth, and fifth step, my ex-husband was on there. Hated his guts, didn't want anything to do with him, okay? He recently passed away, and I went through a lot of emotion with that. And I never wanted to make an amends to him. So he was never going to be on my step 8. I was not going to do this with him. But I will tell you, just the other day, this is so fresh. I was thinking, over the past, what had gone on and everything. And I actually felt forgiveness. And it was so strong for me that, it's not like I'm sitting there going, hey, so-and-so, I forgive you. It was just this overwhelming washing of forgiveness. And for me, that is some brotherly love, that I could have that much forgiveness.
And because you and I share a home group, and I've heard you share on this before, I actually want you to unpack that a little bit more, if you don't mind, because you shared one night at group that there was a reason for that. And it wasn't so much about your husband, your ex-husband, as it was about your son.
Yes. I had a lot of emotion, a lot of tears, a lot of crying with his passing, but it wasn't tears for him or him passing. It was tears for my son, because my son is hurting, and I, as a parent, can't do anything about it. I cannot help my son. Because when I left his father, like I said, I hated him. I didn't know you could hate somebody so much. And I was taught, because he was on my first 4 step, to pray for him. Even if it was God bless that SOB. Pray for him. And I did. I prayed it. I was like, I prayed that for him. After a while, I was able to drop the SOB. After a while, I was just able to say, God bless him. And so the process got me to that forgiveness that I felt. It was just a beautiful thing. I would not have had that without this.
I remember when you shared that in a meeting, I remember thinking it immediately took me to page 567 in the appendix, right? That and the spiritual experience appendix, where it talks about the fact that a spiritual experience is really nothing more than a personality change sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism. And the moment that you experienced that feeling of forgiveness was certainly, at least from what I could see, a change in your personality to be able to have you go from this, this SOB to, just feeling forgiveness for him. And so it was to me, a beautiful experience of that personality change.
Thanks for pointing that out, because I didn't recognize it as a spiritual experience, but yes, you are correct. It definitely was. It has been a big change for me.
Absolutely. One of the things that I always like to do, as many of our listeners have spent a lot of time on the Take the 12 website, and have looked and spent time with the three different studies that are there, the step study, the tradition study, and the concept study that were created for the website. I always like to read just a brief excerpt from in this case, the step study for step 8. So I'm going to read it, and I'm going to see if it generates something for you. In step 8, in the step summary, it says this: an apology is quite different from an amends. One dictionary defines an apology as, quote, an admission of error or discourtesy accompanied by an expression of regret. And it defines an amends as reparation or compensation for a loss, damage, or injury of any kind. I know, and I love that for years, I thought an apology and an amends were the exact same thing, right? But I can offer you an apology when I accidentally step on your toe. Oh, I stepped on your toe. I am so sorry, right? Easy apology. But if I have slept with your wife or slept with your husband, I owe you an amends because I have caused you hurt and harm in some way, right? Does the difference between an apology and an amends resonate for you?
It does. I did think the same thing. An apology and amends was the same thing. I'm sorry I hurt your feelings. But I was taught through sponsorship that an amends is different. And in the amends, you're not just saying, I'm sorry. In fact, I was first told, like, if you say I'm sorry, it's like, yeah, you're right, you're sorry. You are a sorry person, And amends is saying, I apologize for that hurt that I caused you. How can I make it right? To me, that's the difference. You're wanting to make it better than just saying, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. In fact, whenever I am taking someone through the steps, and when we get to step 8, I flat out tell them, I don't ever want to hear you use the word I'm sorry, the words I'm sorry.
Yep.
Or an apology, because how many times as alcoholics have we said the words I'm sorry and they were just hollow, right?
Exactly.
We didn't mean it, right?
Not at all.
Many members here, another excerpt from the reading. Many members of AA think that creating a list of those that we've harmed is only about cleaning up the wreckage of our past with those people, places, or things that we have caused hurt and harm to. And while that is certainly a huge part of it, another reason step 8 is important is because it's about continuing the process we've already started back in step 3 of being of maximum usefulness to God and to his kids. So is it possible that steps 8 and 9 are not about getting back into the good graces of those we've harmed, but about being willing to do the footwork and once again, leaving the results up to God, right?
Yes, exactly. And I was taught very early on, I heard, because when I first came in and I saw steps 4 and 5 on the wall, I thought, oh, that's going to make me drink if I have to do that. I don't want to face that. And then after I did them, I was like, okay, I didn't drink. But when I saw what you had to do with them with 8 and 9, I thought, oh, that's going to make me drink. Happily to say, neither one of them made me drink.
That's right.
But I heard a man say very early on that do step 8 as if you're not going to do a step 9.
Oh, I don't. I've never heard that. I love that.
Yeah, it's because step 8 is making a decision to make a list.
Right.
That's all you're doing. You're just making a list. So don't be afraid of making that list for step 9, because that fear is going to keep you from doing it, and doing it to God's benefit, to what he's going to use you for.
I am so glad you said that, because that is something else that I always share with sponsees when they're on step 8 is, got to remember, step 8 is nothing more than a list. It is not the going out and doing it, right? Going out and actually making the amends. That's the next step. Step 8 is just the list. So I loved what you were told about, write your list as if you're not going to do a step 9, right? Because that removes the fear from it, right?
Exactly.
I love that. One of the things that I am a big believer in, and for those people who have worked in the step study on Take the 12, and it is what I do with my sponsees, I always identify in every step that there is something that we have to surrender. In every single step, there is something that the program, the step itself, God, Bill, whoever, is calling me to let go of. And I believe that in step 8, I get to surrender 3 things. I get to surrender fear of telling the truth. That's the first thing, because when I sit down and write out all of that step, or all of the people, places, or things that I caused hurt and harm to, I am walking through some fear of actually getting it out of my head and down on paper, right? So I get to release the fear of finally telling the truth, because I've been carrying that stuff around for years and throwing lots and lots of alcohol at it, right? That's number 1. Number 2, I get to surrender my need to point out their part. Because how many times have I said, I remember, I think it was in my first official 8 step that I wrote, I would write out some things, and when I were sat down to review it with my sponsor, I would say, well, so I caused this person hurt and harm, but it's only because they, right? And I wanted to point the finger at them. Well, I was justified in doing what I did because of what they did, right? So I got to release, and the literature even tells us that. I get to release the need and surrender the need to be able to point out their part in it. And the last thing that I get to surrender is the fear of the outcome. Right now, that's kind of moving over into step 9, but I to your point, if I can surrender the fear of what's going to be the result of me making this amends, like you said, just write the list as if you're not going to do it. It's easy for me to release that fear. What did you find you had to surrender when you were sitting down and writing your 8th step?
I think that's a lot of what you said. The fear and the wanting to point out what they did. I wouldn't have done that if they hadn't have done this. So that was a lot of what I released too. Just pretty much the same things. I mean, you kind of hit the nail on the head here.
Wonderful, wonderful. Here's another question for you. If any, do you think there are any myths about this step? I mean, what are some of the things that we hear in meetings about this step that, in your experience, you don't believe are true? Like, have we ever heard anyone say in a meeting or sharing, maybe even from the podium, something about step 8 that you're like, well, that just wasn't my experience, or I don't believe that that's true? Whether it be around the actual writing of the list, who should go on the list, what does an amends look like versus what does an apology look like? I remember, like, for instance, I remember when I wrote my first official 4-step, I've written 3, 8 step. I've written 3. I have, over my 35 years of being sober, I have had 3 sponsors take me through the 12 steps, start to finish. And I've written 3 official 4 steps, 3 8 steps, and so forth. When I wrote my first official 4-step, and consequently my first official 8 step, there were no financial amends on them at all. Now, did I know deep down inside that there were? Sure. I did, but I conveniently left it off. Um, I have heard people say, and it just blows my mind every time I hear it, that um, financial amends are not necessary. And I just don't agree with that. I mean, I didn't do them in the beginning, but I have done them since. Amends I mean, because hurt and harm can be defined in a lot of different ways. But has there ever been anything that you've heard people say about step 8 that you're like, well, that's just, I don't think that that's true?
I can't say that, but I agree. You know, the financial means, I've never heard anybody say that, that, you know, that they don't count. I too, you know, just have recently started doing mine. I mean, here I am almost 13 years and I'm just now starting financial amends.
Right.
But one of the things when I'm making my list is I start with who I think I need to make my amends to. And so that's how I'm writing my list. And I will always have a sponsor come back and go, nope, we're not going to do that one. We're going to wait on that one. I did hear, you know, it's like who you're willing to make amends to now, who you're going to pray to make amends to, and who you will never make amends to.
Right.
And I have been taught that there is not a never make amends to. There is a willing to become willing when the time is right to make that amends.
That is right.
And that's just been my experience with that.
I love that, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I too was taught the exact same way. There's the now amends, there's the postponed amends that are going to be done at some time in the future. And then there are the either not applicable, never, you know, they're dead, or, you know, whatever, the company went out of business, or I'm just never going to make that amends. And I remember being told the exact same thing. You know, I needed to make the amends, the now amends now. I just needed, this is a program of action, right? The postponed amends, I always went through my sponsor I gave him my definition of why I put it in the postponed column. And I'll be very honest with you, there were some that whenever, if they started off in the postponed column, they got moved over to the now column after talking to my sponsor.
Exactly. That's what I was just going to say. It's the same thing with me. My nows went to my postponed, and my postponed became my nows. I mean, my whole list got rearranged. So yeah, I understand that.
For sure. And the nevers, the willingness to be willing, right? Just
Exactly.
you're absolutely right. And there, it was kind of like with my six step character defects. When my sponsor asked me, are you entirely ready to have all your defects removed? I said, yeah, all but one. And having just listened to my fifth step, he knew exactly which one I was talking about. I'm not going to go into it here, but he said, that's cool. You know what the book says about that? That if there is a defect that I'm not willing to let go of, that I get to pray for the willingness to be willing to let go of it. And the exact same thing applies here with the 8th step, right? If there's an amends that I'm not willing to make, then I just pray for the willingness to be willing to make that amends. And as long as my intent is good and my heart is true, and I'm not just being obnoxious and stubborn, as a lot of alcoholics can be on any given day and moment, then it will eventually happen, right? If my heart's in the right place. Let's change gears for just a minute. You're 13 years sober. You have, I know because I've heard your story or parts of your story, that you have had multiple sponsors. And I also know that you have had the opportunity to sponsor women. Let's talk about the sponsor-sponsee relationship where it comes to step 8. You've talked a little bit about it, but let's kind of unpack that a little bit more. When teaching a sponsee how to take this step, is there one specific thing that you always want them to know about this step before they sit down and start writing?
It's just like I said before, do it as if you're not going to do a 9. Write it all down. Just, you know, make that list and just put it out there. I just basically bluntly tell them, Don't even think about it. Write it down. If it pops in your head, maybe I might owe an amends to somebody, write it down.
I agree with that 100%. You know, many of us were taught by our sponsors that if we wanted to learn how to be in healthy relationships with the world around us, we could take a deeper look at the traditions, right? And I'm reading a little bit more from the STEP study, and it says woven throughout each of the traditions are wonderful suggestions on how we can better show up to those relationships. And interestingly enough, steps 8 and 9 do that as well. On page 77 of the 12 and 12, it states this, quote, steps 8 and 9 are concerned with personal relations. First, we have to take a look backward and try to discover where we've been at fault. Next, we make a vigorous attempt to repair the damage we have done. Vigorous. I love the Bill's choice of words, right? Vigorous. Vigorous attempt to repair the damage that we've done. And third, having thus cleared away the debris of the past, we consider how, with our newfound knowledge of ourselves, we may develop the best possible relations with every human being we know. Has it been your experience that after making your amends that were on your 8-step list, that you have been able to experience that?
Oh yeah. There have been multiple times. I have learned a lot about myself, finding where I was at fault, where I thought there was none. And being able to make an amends to someone, have the relationship be better. And that's what I try. I just try to carry this every day, whether I've made an amends or need to make an amends to somebody. I just always try to go for that best possible relation, with every human being I meet. I had one just recently, when I changed sponsors. I redid 4th and 5th step and went on to another 8 and 9. And there was a girl that I had been friends with for a long time. And then I just kind of quit. I just, COVID hit, and I used that as the perfect reason to not be in contact. I just totally dropped it. A totally wrong thing to do, but I recently was able to make an amend to her. And the definition of our relationship has changed, but it's still there. We are still, we're still good friends, so my fault in what I had done and being able to look at that and then go to her and say, I was wrong to behave this way. How can I make it right? It opened up her and our relationship on a different level. And I've even noticed that she is working on, because she's also in the program, she's also working on the relationships with other people. She got one of our books through Grapevine on relationships. And so I don't know, maybe it was good for both of us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we've been talking about how the outcome is good when we make the amends. We've talked a little bit about that. Let's talk for a second about when it's not. I have an example recently within the last 6 months of my life where I had caused some hurt and harm to another member of Alcoholics Anonymous, member of my home group, and it just was, it was not nice, and it was mean, and it was hateful, and I was pretty devastated by the behavior, even though I did it, and I reached out to my sponsor and walked through it with him, and he gave me very clear-cut directions on what to do, how to follow the literature, how to follow the book, follow the process as outlined in the book on making an amends. And I did that, and I did exactly what I was taught to do and what I've known to do. Unfortunately, the outcome was not good. I was told by this person that, Rick, I thank you for making your amends, I guess, but I just don't trust you. And I will never trust you. And I thought we were friends, and I will never see us being friends again. And I was devastated by that, because I mean, I love this woman, and have for a very, very long time. And it was very hard for me to hear those words coming from her mouth. But you know what? Either I trust God or I don't. And I trust the outcome or I don't. And I remember going back to my sponsor and saying, I did what I was supposed to do, and she didn't accept the amends. And he said, okay, well, check, move on. And I'm like, what? What do you mean check, move on?
Right.
I couldn't let go of it. I struggled. I was carrying it. I was beating myself up. Even though I did the work, to make amends for the hurt and harm that I had caused, but it didn't produce the outcome that I had expected. So it was another example for me that this is not about getting back into the good graces of those we've harmed. It is about being willing to do the footwork and leave the results up to God, right?
Right. I have to say, I have not had that experience. The amends that I've made, and maybe I don't want to say maybe I haven't made a deep enough one. I don't know that they're there, but the amends I have made have had acceptable outcome. Oh, you know what? I just had one. It just dawned on me. I had to make an amends to a woman whose husband was in the program. She was not. And this was early in my sobriety that this happened. And it was probably about 10 years sober that it dawned on me, oh, I think I owe this woman an amends. And my sponsor told me, then you need to talk to the husband to let his wife know that you are wanting to make this amends with her. Is that okay with her? And the woman said, no, I will not meet her. She can write a letter. And I was just kind of, whoa.
Right.
So I wrote the letter and never heard another word.
Mm,
But I did my part.
right.
I did what I was supposed to do. So that that took that constant thought in my head running around of, oh, you harmed this woman, you did this, you're so bad, blah, blah, blah. That took that away for me. I did what I was supposed to do. So I believe God relieved me of that obsession of beating myself up over that particular instance.
Right. And we just got to trust. We've got to trust that in God's time, in God's way, it's going to all work itself out in the best way possible. I remember early on in sobriety, I made an amends to a woman that I had caused a lot of hurt and harm to her and her husband. And when I made the amends, she flat out told me, Rick, I'm really glad that you've gotten your life together, because you really needed to. But I do not accept your amends, and I will never accept your amends. What you did to us is unforgivable, and I will never forgive you. And for years, I'm talking probably 15, 20 years, I had to live with that. I did the work, but I had to live with that. And what was interesting was, one day out of the blue, and I hadn't talked to this woman in years, out of the blue, I get a DM from her or something, Facebook Messenger. I don't even remember how it was, but she reached out to me because she was about to go on her first cruise, and she knew she had been watching on Facebook. Even though we weren't talking, we were still connected. She had been watching that I had been going on a lot of cruises, and so she wanted to reach out to me and get some experience on how to go on a cruise. And I remember when she reached out, I was like, oh my God, I was blown away. And that opened the door for a relationship that she and I have today. In fact, she lives in Jacksonville, Florida now, but she was actually in town this week. And I got to see her yesterday, and she gave me a great big hug and told me that she loved me. And I thought, man, if that's not God at work, I don't know what is, right?
Exactly. That's awesome.
It's
That is
amazing.
awesome.
Amazing.
Mm.
So let's talk for a second about inventory. Inventory is a big word to some, but I believe that taking inventory on a regular basis is vital to the maintenance of my spiritual program. Around step 8, what did inventory look like for you as you were sitting down to write out your list? What what did that inventory look like in you being able to get that list written? Now, I know that at least with my sponsees, they have their 4-step, and the literature even says referring back to our list again, meaning referring back to our 4-step. We get to identify the people that we caused hurt and harm to. Was it hard for you to write that list, and what did inventory look like when you were writing it?
Well, when I first saw inventory, my first thought of doing an inventory went back to a day when I worked for a pool company and we had to count nuts and bolts. It's just kind of like that was an inventory. So I really didn't know what to expect on doing an inventory on myself for this. And even on the 4-step, your fears column, I wrote spiders. I mean, it was just,
Right.
I didn't know what I was doing. But this last one I did was probably the best 4th and 5th step I've ever done. I mean, it was so beneficial for me. And the doing the inventory, making the list was deep this time. I was able to look deeper into myself, what harms I have caused and who am I going to make an amends to.
Mhm.
And making this list on 8, it came from my 4-step. And I put down the things that I wanted to make amends to. I'm going to make amends to this person right now. They need it. They got to have this. And my sponsor said, no, that one's not going to happen yet. That one you're going to do by action. So I put everything down. My list this time, like I direct my sponsees, was a lot longer than my previous 4th, 5th, 8th steps. It was a long list, and I'm still working on it today. So I mean, I don't know if that answers your question, but I
Sure.
put everything down.
Sure it does. Sure it does. And you kind of touched on something that I wanted to ask you about as well. We hear bannered around in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous this idea of a living amends. You know, um, what in your mind, what does a living amends look like?
A living amends, and in this particular situation, with this family member, is that I'm living my life differently. I am not defaulting to the same actions
That's right.
and responses. I am living my life differently. And I mean, sometimes it's a conscious effort for me to live differently, to act differently. But if I'm acting differently, I'm not acting falsely.
Right.
I'm still acting from my heart. And I will tell you that by doing this, by not going to this person and say, I owe you an amends, here's what I have done, how can I make it right? Just by living my life differently, acting differently, has changed the relationship with that person already.
You nailed it. You absolutely nailed it. My definition of a living amends is 2 words: changed behavior.
Exactly.
You
That's
know,
what it
you
is.
you nailed it. You nailed it. Mary, thank you so much. We're about out of time. Is there anything that you would like to offer as a closing comment on step 8? Anything that you want our listeners to remember as they begin to put the spiritual principle of love and brotherly love, as you put it, into practical application in their lives?
It's again, doing the step 8 is if you're not going to do a 9. But the main thing that I get out of it, made a list of persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. That's the biggest part to me for step 8, is to become willing.
Right.
And that's all you have to do.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. Thank you for your time and thank you for your service. I'm confident that our listeners will be able to take away a lot from your sharing. So thank you for being with us today. I really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it. Just a reminder to everyone that you can go to takethe12.org to learn more about all 3 of our legacies in AA through STEP, tradition, and concept studies, blog posts, videos, books, guided meditations, and so much more. Until next time, let us not forget Bill W.'s words when he said this: "We clearly see AA in 3 dimensions: the dimension of recovery, the dimension of unity, and the dimension of service. Without any of these, AA could not function." God bless.